Hey guys, Rachel here. I get a lot of questions from you about camera settings, and today I thought I would share with you how I have my camera set up, the internal settings that I use when I'm out taking photos. So first of all, it really depends on what kind of camera you have. The names that are given to different settings can be slightly different. However, most of them are going to be relatively similar if you're shooting with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera for your photography. I use a Sony A992, and so the terms that I'm using are going to be applicable to Sony. However, you might be using a Nikon or a Canon or a Pentax or any other brand of camera, and you may have to just quickly Google and see what the actual setting name is for your camera. But the essential different types of settings should all be the same. The first setting on my camera is the quality. You have several different options, probably RAW, JPEG, and quality settings for JPEGs. I shoot in RAW. I've always shot in RAW. The most information possible is gathered by your camera and it is unprocessed, which means that when you go and you import your images into Photoshop, into Lightroom, or whatever image editing program that you use on your computer, you have as much information there as possible, which gives you the most flexibility in terms of customizing the image the way that you want it. So if I import a RAW file into my computer, it will often look kind of flat. Now all of the information is there, but I need to do the adjustments. Adjustments to saturation, adjustments to color balance, white balance, all of that I can adjust, shadows, highlights, and because it's a RAW file, I can do a lot more movement in each of these settings than I could if I were shooting in JPEG. If you shoot in JPEG, your camera actually does processing of the image for you beforehand. So the saturation, the shadows, all of that, the camera has a program that allows it to determine what would be best for that image, and it will process it for you. I prefer to process my own. It gives me more flexibility, more creativity, so I shoot in RAW. Next up, your camera will probably have a setting for color space. So you may have the option of Adobe RGB or sRGB, as I have in my camera. However, it's important to note that if you are shooting in RAW, like I do, the color space doesn't matter. The color space will actually be applied by your editing program. So in my camera, I have a setting that is there. However, I shoot in RAW, so it's not going to matter what color space I have chosen, because that's going to be applied later by myself in my editing program. Now on to white balance. There are so many options for white balance in a camera. You can have auto white balance, or you can set it specifically for the situation that you're in. I use auto white balance. The reason is that I find that this camera, the Sony camera, is excellent at determining a proper white balance for the situations that I'm in. So I always have my camera on auto white balance, except for when I am doing night sky photography. When I do night sky photography, I will go down to my custom white balance and I will actually change the Kelvin to what I want, and often I will go a lot more blue so that the images are more true to the dark night sky. Now what happens when the camera in auto white balance does not quite do it the way that I want it to be done? No problem. Because I shoot in RAW, I'm processing my images anyway in Lightroom and Photoshop, and I can easily change my white balance in there to whatever it is that I would like it to really look like. I can make it very, very precise, and so auto white balance, it's no muss, no fuss, it's great, and that's what I use. So drive mode. Drive mode is something that I change often depending on the situation. Right now my drive mode is on single shooting, and that's because the last thing that I was shooting was handheld, and so I was just moving along, and I want the image to be taken as soon as I press the shutter button. But when I'm using a tripod, I will have it on the 2-second timer most of the time. You can go up to a 10-second timer, and that is important, say if I need to get out of the image to make sure that my shadow's not in it or something, or if you're taking pictures with family and you want to get into the image, 10-second timer is great. But if you're just doing landscapes and you're on a tripod, then I will be using the 2-second timer. The 2-second delay makes sure that it settles down and there's no motion blur due to my touching the camera. And that's what I use all the time when I'm on a tripod. The other drive mode that I can sometimes use is if I'm really shooting something that's moving quickly, continuous shooting, which is I hold down the shutter button and the camera keeps taking pictures. Click, 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 really, really fast. I use this one less often. When I was doing my last video with the birds and the squirrels, I was still doing single shooting, but the continuous shooting can definitely be helpful. Just be ready to be using up a lot of SD card space. The focus mode that I use is single shot autofocus. You can also use continuous autofocus. The difference is when I push my shutter button halfway down and my camera starts to focus, single shot means that I will focus right away on the one thing, and as I keep my finger on that button, that focus is locked. It's going to stay on whatever I have determined, or the camera has determined the autofocus to be on. Now, continuous autofocus is if you have a really, really quickly moving subject and you want to continually have the focus on that subject that's moving across the frame, continuous focus will follow that subject as it moves. Now, if it's quickly moving, that can be really, really helpful. I still prefer the single shot autofocus in most situations because I like to know that where I have clicked it, I'm not trusting the camera to decide where that focus has fallen and for it to move in a split second to a place that I don't want it to be, and then I've possibly lost the shot. So I have it on single shot autofocus and I pretty much never move it. Although continuous autofocus does have its advantages, and I can't say that I've never used it. It's a good mode as well. Now, where does the focus land? My focus area is set to spot focus. In fact, it's set to flexible spot. So in my Sony camera, what that means is there is a little square in the viewfinder and it shows me where the focus is going to be. When I push the button, the shutter button halfway down, it will set the focus on that area. So I have chosen exactly where I want the focus to be set. And I may actually recompose it so that the sharp subject is maybe off to the right, and yet it'll still be in focus because I have it locked. The nice thing about flexible spot focus is that I can move that spot around the frame. So I may be in a situation where I can't recompose the image, or it's not really desirable to do so. Say if I'm on a tripod or something, I don't want to be moving the camera around. I can move the spot over to where I want the focus to be. Then set the focus. I've got my 2-second timer and done. Now, metering mode is something that definitely a lot of people have questions about. How do you set your metering and what are the differences between them? I have my metering mode set to multi, and what that means is that my camera will analyze the scene based on all the different areas of the image, and it will determine a good metering exposure based on the entire image. You can also have it set to a center weighted metering mode, which means that it will analyze the entire scene, but it will put more emphasis on the center of the scene when it's determining a good exposure. There's also center point metering, where it will just use the center point to determine the metering. So if you have a really bright center and the rest of the image is dark, it's going to meter for that bright center. So you just want to determine what kind of metering mode is really going to help with your kind of photography. I have it on multi-metering. The Sony A992 has a special feature called Steady Shot. And what that is really is just in-camera image stabilization. And believe it or not, I have this setting off. And that is because most of the time I am shooting on a tripod. So what happens with the image stabilization is that when it is off, there are moving parts inside the camera that will just slightly freely move, and it helps the image to be sharp. Now, it's kind of difficult to explain, but if I'm handheld and I'm moving around, if you have something that is just kind of free floating on the inside, it's not moving as much with all of my motion. So it does actually help the image to stay more steady. However, when you're on a tripod, you want those internal parts to be locked in place, because the internal parts locked in place means nothing is moving and you're going to get the steadiest shot possible. So I have image stabilization or steady shot turned off. So for my display on the back of my camera, I have my horizon level there always, because I like to make sure when I am on landscape photography that my horizon is level. That's just one of the things that is really important to me. When I see an image, I love to see a straight horizon. My shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation, ISO, and my horizon level. That's how I use my display. After I've taken the shot, there is another display, and sometimes I will use the histogram. And that's if I'm just concerned about the shadows or the highlights being clipped or blown out. And so I will have the histogram just display alongside the picture so that I can see if I'm okay in terms of capturing the details that I want. Most of the time though, I don't have this on. I just have the quick 2-second full picture review, and then I move on to my next. So your camera may have slightly different names for these settings, but if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, or even a point and shoot with some more functions, you're probably going to have the same kind of options. So I hope that this has been helpful. If you have any questions about specific settings that I've mentioned, or maybe some that I haven't mentioned, I'd be happy to try and help. Just ask your question below, and I will talk to you soon. Okay? Thanks, guys. Bye.